Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to paint a Bloodthirster, a greater demon of the god of chaos and destruction, Khorne. This is a pretty iconic model from the Games Workshop range, especially if you've ever played Dawn of War. That was a really good unit in that game. He's basically a big red angry with a giant axe, massive wings and teeth and claws everywhere. I'll be using a few different techniques in this video, such as airbrushing and dry brushing, and I'll also show you how to do a nice easy fire effect and also a molten metal effect. This is quite a big model, so it does take a bit of time, but bear with me and I'll see you at the end. Now this is a big ass model, so I'm going to save a lot of time for myself by using the airbrush to base this. And I'm starting with the Vallejo Surface Primer Black, and then I'm just going to do a quick white highlight from the top. And with this white highlight, I'm going to try and pick out all the raised areas on the wings, and then just do a top down spray on the top of the body of the model. This just picks out all the natural highlights for you and just gives you a bit of an impression in your mind of where highlights are supposed to be. If you pretend that this white spray is the sun and it's coming from above, that's sort of where you want your highlights to be. This is probably my favourite part of painting these models, even though it's the start of it. It's just, everything looks really cool once it's got that white highlight on. You can really see the definition and all the muscles and all the little bits that are hanging off the armour and all that. Now I want this red to be really nice and rich, so I'm going to start with a brown. And this brown is Vallejo Game Air, and it's charred brown. I haven't actually used any of these Game Air colours before. I've used plenty of the model airs and the model Vallejo colours. I believe this one is got a slightly glossy finish to it, as it's got a little bit of finishing agent in there to stop your models from chipping, so I'm interested to see how this turns out. But considering my next few coats are going to be pure matte colours, I don't think we're going to see the gloss too much. And also at this point you can see I've removed the whip, which actually just clips in onto where it's supposed to be on his hand, so that's easy to remove, otherwise it's going to be really painful to try and get around that with a brush. And I'm just going to do that this same brown. At this stage I hadn't decided what colour I was going to paint the wings, but I was still going to do the fingers red and the arm as well. And I don't really mind about getting a bit of brown on the membrane because I'm going to be painting over it anyway. Now to start the reds on this model, I'm going to be using Game Colour Gory Red. And this colour is pretty much the equivalent of Khorne Red, and it's a good bridge between brown and red because it's almost a burgundy itself. And I'm going to spray this colour mostly from the top of the model because I want to still leave the darkest recesses with that brown colour. And as we build up these reds, I'm going to be a little bit more and more selective about where I put it. Another Game Colour model, this is Bloody Red, and this is a slightly lighter red. And again, we're going to be hitting this from mostly the top angle of the model. And as you can see, it's already building up quite a nice highlight. And we haven't even spent that much time on the model yet. See, getting an airbrush is a really good investment for saving time. As I was painting these wings, I could see a purple colour coming through, so that's the colour I decided to do the membranes on the wing. And this colour is Game Colour Alien Purple. And I'm just going to coat this over all the membrane, and I'm going to come back to it later with a bit of dry brushing. And now we're done with the airbrush, we're going to start washing all this red. And because I want to keep this red quite rich still, I'm going to use a brown wash to keep it nice and dark. And this is going to go pretty much all over the skin of this model. And I'm not going to worry too much about where I put it, I'm just going to make it go all over this model. Because I'm going to be dry brushing it after this, so it doesn't really matter if I've got any rough patches of wash left on the flatter areas. And to darken down and wash the purple a little bit, I'm going to make my own wash from Contrast Medium and Black Templar. This is just a little bit of a stronger pigment than the Null Oil that I usually use as a black wash. And the Contrast Medium is going to make it flow really well into all the little recesses. Going back to the red skin, we're going to start our first highlight, which is Wild Rider Red. And using a large dry brush, I'm going to start dragging this over all the muscly parts of the model. And this dry brushing is going to make sure we only catch the raised parts of the model and leaves all the dark recesses nice and dark, which gives you a nice bit of contrast. And if you really want to accentuate that contrast, do only downstrokes. And if you want it to be a little bit more balanced, do the up and down. I want this red to look quite poppy, so I'm concentrating more on the downstrokes. The next step for the red is actually an orange, and this is Troll Slayer Orange, and I'm going to use this quite sparingly because it is quite vivid. And being just a little bit lighter with my dry brushing, just so it doesn't make it look too orange. But if we do it right, this is going to complement the red really well and make it look really bright and poppy. Stepping it up just a little bit brighter is Fire Dragon Bright, and the same principle, just even lighter still and even more selective. Now, as we've got the dry brush out, I'm going to start dry brushing the wings, and this is Genestealer Purple. And again, I'm working with mainly downward strokes just to try and catch the highest raised areas of the membrane. If I was to do this model again, I would actually rethink completely how I was going to do these wings, because if you see the little holes and little gaps on there, they're actually the thinnest parts of the wings, so they should be the lightest parts in theory. So I think the best approach for my next Bloodthirster that I'll do is to start with white and dry brush over the top with the darker colours. That way all those little dark deep areas are going to stay light and white, so they'll look nice and transparent. And I'm going to mix a little bit of pink horror into this gradually as we go, just to sort of build up the colour blend. And this is going to be mainly on the lower 2/3 of each membrane. And now I'm going to base all the steel armor parts in Rhinox Hide, and I found this to be a really good jumping off point for making a worn realistic looking steel, which I'll show you how to do a little bit later. And while I'm here, I'm going to do the hooves and the horns on the head. And now with a small dry brush, I'm going to take some Vallejo gunmetal and just dry brush it all over the brown parts. And the purpose for the brown is to just give a little bit of variation on these metallic parts. And that brown undercoat paired with a dry brush is perfect for making it look nice and realistic. And as you can see here, it's not just a boring flat silver, it's got a bit of everything there. And to step it up again, we're going to go up in the shades of silver to this exhaust manifold. And we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to be a little bit more selective, a little bit less heavy on the dry brush side. So you want to be taking most of the paint off when you drag your brush on the paper towel. And just a little bit selective when you go around these parts, try and pick the raised areas if you can. And this dry brush is going to bring out all those little details on the armor. And of course 3 is the magic number, so next step is Duraluminium. And these metallic paints are so good, it feels like you're just buffing the metal. And this is now my new favourite way to paint steel. Once those loose pieces were done, I tried my best to be as careful as I could on these bits that are attached to the model. In retrospect, I probably should have left these off and just kept them brown from the airbrushing stage, but hindsight's 20/20. And for the second metallic on this model, I'm going to be using Balthasar Gold. And I'm going to be using this on all the decorative parts of the armor and various bits and bobs on the model, like the little skin hooks and parts of the belt. And don't forget the demon shoes to make them extra stompy. And this Balthasar Gold is quite difficult to work with. I find I have to shake the pot really well to mix the colour. And if anyone has an alternative, please put it in the comments, I'd love to know. And I'll come back and wash and highlight these later. For all the teeth, skulls and bones on this model, I'm going to use Zandri Dust as a base. And starting with the teeth, I'm just going to be really careful and try and pick out each individual tooth. If we can leave that nice dark gap between them, they'll look really defined, and once we get that highlight on them, they'll look pretty awesome. And I use the same approach for the horns as well, where I try to leave a little bit of darkness right at the base of each horn. And then I'm going to move on to the plethora of skulls on this model. And there are quite a few of them, which is not surprising, as we know Khorne's catchphrase is blood for the blood god and skulls for the skull throne. So if you want to impress Khorne, you better be prepared to carry around a lot of trophies on your armor. And have a good look around the model, find any other spiky bits that you want to be bone coloured. There are a few little sneaky spiky bits on this model, and I nearly forgot to do the nails, so I'm going back to do them now. And now the little stuff's out of the way, we're going to move on to the shaft of this axe, and I'm switching to a bigger brush and I'm just going to brush this all over. It's pretty painful because of the intricate shapes of this, but just be thankful it's not a resin model. And it helps to thin your paint out quite a lot when you're doing things like this. It just means you're going to have to do a few extra coats. And make sure you try and leave the eye holes alone on the skulls. If you do happen to get paint inside them, it's not the end of the world, it just means you're just going to have to wash them a little bit heavier, just to bring out that definition on the sockets and the nose. And for the little claws on the end of the wings, I'm going to base them in Abaddon Black. And in the future, I'm going to try and avoid using black straight out of the pot, because it's quite a boring colour. And I found in experiments by mixing in blues and browns and things like that, you can make some really interesting shades. And it also gives you a little bit more versatility in terms of highlighting and shading, because if you go straight for black, there's not really anywhere you can go for making shadows. But for now, it's just boring old black. And now I'm going to wash all the armor parts in Nuln Oil. And for the armor parts that have the gilded logos on them, I'm going to try and work the wash around the edges of it so it creates a nice little dark outline between the brass and the silver. And that's pretty much what I use washes for, is just to create definition between areas. But you don't always necessarily need to even use washes. If your technique involves a lot of shading and highlighting, you might not need to. It's not an essential part of the process. And for my next shade, I'm going to be using Agrax Earthshade, which is a brown wash. And I'm going to be putting this over all the brass and bronze parts of this model, and also all the horns, teeth and skulls. And focus on getting it in all the little nooks and crannies to really bring out the detail on this massive model. And especially around the teeth, you really want them to pop, because that's probably going to be the first thing people look at when they see this model. And in all the little horns and claws and nails and things like that on this model, there are all sorts of little details like little holes and little grooves that you really want to fill in with this brown wash. And you don't need to worry too much if you think you're using too much wash, because we're going to be picking out a lot of these details with new coats of Zandri Dust. Now once all those washes have dried, we're going to pick out all these details again using the same Zandri Dust. And when you're painting these horns, you just need to work towards the point of each horn. And that makes sure that that end is going to be a lighter shade than the rest of it, which is going to make it look a little bit more realistic. When it comes to the skulls, just work around the eye sockets, the brow and the cheekbones, and then eventually when you come down to the teeth, see if you can pick out each individual tooth. But the skulls on this shaft are pretty small, so don't worry too much if you can't, because you can always put a little bit more wash on them to define the teeth a little bit better. You could just as easily dry brush this axe as well, because it's pretty large, and that would come out with a nice effect, and that would save you the hassle of having to pick out all the little parts. But on the other hand, you have to do a little bit more cleanup, because no doubt you're going to get a bit of that paint on the other sections of the model. So it's up to you which method you want to choose, but I just found this was probably the easiest for me. And continuing with the teeth and horns and stuff, we're going to bring it up with Ubshabti Bone, and this is going to be our first highlight for this colour. And for the horns, I'm going to do pretty much the same as before, but about half as much, and still finishing on the tip, just so you keep that highlight on the point there. And on the skulls, the same as we did before, just tracing around all the cheekbones and eye sockets. And also some of these skulls have little cracks on them, you can just trace that edge out as well with this. For these horns, I just decided to get the dry brush back out and just run it across these broad lines that are on each of the horns. And as I said before, the face is quite a drawing point of this model, so I want to put a little bit more attention to detail on these parts. Now with the Vallejo Duraluminium, I'm going to start picking out all these metallic parts. And starting with this chain, I'm just going to start picking out the individual links, leaving a little dark area where they connect with each other. And on the armor parts, I'm just going to pick out the harsh edges and just going around all the little chips and cracks that you see on this, and along the edges of the lobstered sections of the armor. Now with Gehennas Gold, we're going to start highlighting all the bronze parts. And essentially the same principle, just going around and picking out all the little harsh edges. And luckily these Khorne logos have plenty of sharp edges on them, so it's easy to see where you should be highlighting. And don't forget to apply all this to the loose bits of armor that we have knocking around. Now it's time to start painting the Molten axe, and we're just going to pick out a few flamey, fiery colours, including a dark brown which is going to be used for all the little bits of the cooled metal. And we're just going to start by doing a thin coat of Jakero Orange over all of this, and you'll probably need 2 or 3 coats for this because it's pretty transparent. And this is going to serve as our mid-tone, and we're going to base this effect around this colour. Now it's a little bit of a tug of war between the light and dark colours, and you just keep balancing out until it looks right. And I'm going to start darkening it down now with this Squig Orange, and I'm going to start doing this around the perimeter of the axe blade. And the general idea of this is to have the darker colour where the metal is cooling, so on the thinner parts and the harsh edges. And you want the lighter colour where the metal is hottest, so that will be in the thicker parts where it's retaining the heat. And each time I change my colour, I mix it with about 50% of the previous colour, just so it gives you a nice smooth transition in the colours. And at the end of this, your palette should look like a nice little sunset gradient. And next up is this Wild Rider Red, and that's going to get us to these deep oranges. I decided I need a little bit more red in there, so I chose this Blood Angels Red, which is a contrast paint, so it's already really thin, and that makes it easier for us to mix it with our previous oranges. And I'm going to add this to the extreme edges and on the little ridge that runs down the middle of this blade. And I'm randomizing the thickness on these lines just to give it a little bit more effect and a little bit more character. And there's a little bit of back and forth coming up, so I'm going to speed up this video and you can watch the whole process. And to finish it off, just a little bit of the Blood Angels Red contrast paint just to add a little bit of a red glow. Now that's most of the actual model done. I'm going to start basing it, starting with a little bit of trusty corkboard. And what I'm going for is a sort of cracked rock effect, like it's sort of erupting from the ground. And I'm going to mix in a little bit of blood as well, so it's going to be a flamey, bloody, scully mess. And once I glued all that corkboard down, I'm going to start adding a few more skulls to this, because I didn't think it was quite scully enough. Now Khorne's a simple god, he doesn't ask for much, just 2 things, blood and skulls, so I think we can provide on this base. And I'm just going to fill a couple of the gaps in the cracks with these skulls. And just with a bit of PVA, I'm just going to pick them up with tweezers and drop them into the little holes. And this PVA dries clear, so you don't have to worry about using too much of it or making it look too messy. Now I added a bit of sand to the base using some watered down PVA just in little sections, and now I'm going to start spraying it black. Now I didn't want to cut the model off the base, so what I did was wrap the model in a cut up plastic glove and some masking tape, and then just proceeded to use the rattle cans. Just a quick spray of black and a little top highlight with white. Now I think I went a bit overboard with the white, so I'm just toning it down a bit with a bit of black Templar, which is a contrast paint. And with the skulls, I'm going to go over them with this Skeleton Horde contrast paint, just to start the toning of them, and then I'm going to highlight them later, using the same colours as we did with the other skulls on the model. For the blood effects, I'm going to be using this Vallejo water texture. And this is a really fun medium to use if you want to do any little puddles of water or mini lakes and stuff like that. It's not really designed for big stuff because it can crack. It's kind of like a diluted resin. And you can add pretty much any sort of paint to add a pigment to this. Now I'm going to start using this red wash here, but as you can see it's not very strong. It looks more like Ribena than blood, so I'm going to add some of this Blood Angel's red contrast, and this really gives it a bit of a kick. It's like instant gore, and what I'm going to do is use a pipette to get this into all the little crevices. Now this stuff does lose a lot of its volume as it's dry, so it's good to go a little overboard with it. And if you're not quite satisfied with it, you can wait for it to dry and do multiple layers. But as I said before, this stuff's not really designed to do really thick volumes of water, mainly just puddles and things like that. Now this stuff takes a long time to dry, so I'd recommend leaving it at least overnight. It's quite hard to tell just by looking at how dry it is because it retains a lot of its gloss. Now we're going to stop hanging the flames on the base, and this is a really similar process to what we did on the axe. And I'm starting from the middle again, and we're basically working from yellow to orange, like in this little diagram here. And you basically just want to use this gradient to build your flame. Starting with the yellow as the source of the flame and building up to the reds, which are the little licks that come off the edges of the fire. And then in small amounts on the extremes I use white and brown respectively for hot and cold. Now generally on models the thicker parts are where the flame is combusting the fuel, so that's where you want it to be brightest. And the tendrils that run away from that body are where the flame is flickering away, so that will be where it's darkest. And we use the especially dark colours like the browns and the blacks to sort of give the impression that the flame is flickering away into nothing. Now you will need a few coats of this orange paint. Orange generally works better when you've primed it in white, but seeing as I've already started in black, I'm just going to have to bear with it and do a couple of coats. And as I'm stepping up on the red scale of the oranges, I'm starting from the tips and working my way back down to the base of the fire. And as with the axe, it's a bit of a tug of war between these colours, so don't be worried about going back and forth between the oranges and the yellows. Just keep working until you're happy with the look. And those little bits of brown and white that we're going to be putting on later are going to really make it pop anyway. There's a sneaky little face in these flames too, so I'm just going to pick that out with the sharpest yellow. When I'm adding this brown, I make sure to do it really thin so it blends in nice and easily, because it can be quite harsh against that red. And this is airbrush paint as well, so it's already quite thin, but I'm just going to thin it down even more just so we don't have any harsh straight lines on this flame. And now I'm going to start mixing some white into my yellows. And this is for our extreme highlights. And I'm going to start by highlighting a few of the key details on this little face that's in the flame. Mainly the little bit of cheekbone, you can see a bit of the skull and around the mouth. And I'm just going to add little bits onto the base and the thicker parts of this flame. And as you can see, it really helps push that contrast already. And that's pretty much all for these flames. I just go a little bit back and forth with the browns and the whites just to balance it out a little bit more. But doing everything really slowly and really thin just to make sure everything's blended as well as we can. Now I wanted to start painting a little glow for this flame, so I started with a medium red, really thin down, and just washing around the edges of the fire. And making sure to catch any of the faces that are facing the fire, such as the back of the skulls and the little post that's sticking up just in front of the model. And you can use more water to blend in any bits that look a little bit too harsh, like this bit here at the back. And I felt like this glow needed to be a lot brighter, so I stepped it up with an orange, and I'm going to use a dry brush and start dragging out from the center. And then I gradually added a little bit more yellow and started doing it a little bit more selectively from the center. Now I wanted to darken up this rocky texture we've got on the base here, so I used a bit of black Templar contrast paint just to run it around the edges. And to add a little bit of extra gore, I'm going to be using some blood for the blood god just to fill in the little gaps around the edges. And I think you have to use this paint on any Khorne models, to be honest. And after cleaning up a few parts on the wings and attaching them, I think we're about done with this model. And there we have a Bloodthirster of Khorne. I've always wanted to have one of these models in my cabinet, and now I've got it. And I think he needs an army now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in about 3 or 4 weeks, because I'm actually going to be renovating this studio, which I'll be documenting on video so you can see how I do it all. It's quite exciting. I got some new cabinets and stuff, been a bit crazy at IKEA. And hopefully you can take some from those videos for your own studio ideas. Thank you, see you later.